Well, hello again, boys and girls. Today I'm going to tell you a Bible lesson, and it comes from the book of 2 Kings, chapter 6 and 7. And there's three characters in this story that I want you to recognize. One of them is Elisha. Now, I didn't say Elijah, I said Elisha. And how will you know which one is Elisha? Because he's bald. He doesn't have any hair. When we get into the pictures, you'll see this bald guy. That's Elisha. All right? Well, the second person in the story is King Jehoram. And King Jehoram is the king of Israel at this time. And he's living in Samaria, which is the capital city. And how will you know who King Jehoram is? Well, he's the one wearing the crown. Of course, he's a king. He's wearing a crown. So the guy with the crown is King Jehoram. And then there's this third guy, and he's got a smirk on his face. Do you know what a smirk looks like? Sort of like a crooked grin. And they're telling you that they think you're weird. They don't believe what you're saying, okay? The smirk kind of tells you that. But I don't know what his name is because the Bible never tells me his name. So we're just going to call him the right-hand man, the king's right-hand man. He's wearing a smirk on his face, okay? All right, so the story starts out like this. In 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 24, and it came to pass after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his host and went up and besieged Samaria. Now, Syria was just to the north of Israel. And Syria and Israel were always fighting back and forth. But it says here that he gathered all his hosts. That means he gathered all of his armies, got all of the armies together, and they came up against Samaria to besiege it, which means they camped around it so that nobody could come out of the city. Nobody could go into the city without going by this army, this huge army. And of course, the army would probably kill them if they tried to go into the city or they tried to come out of the city. And so the city was surrounded by walls. And the Syrians knew that they probably couldn't get over those walls. So this is what they did. They camped around it so nobody could come in or nobody could go out, and they couldn't get any food in the city. And so pretty soon they started running out of food, and people started starving to death. Now, what would you think of this if your mom said to you, well, son, today we're going to have donkey's head for supper. Ooh, yuck. Would you pay for a donkey's head to eat? No, I don't think I'd like that, but that's how starving they were. They couldn't get any food, and so they were even buying donkey's heads to eat. And that's not all. No, they were buying bird poop. So let's suppose you got up in the morning and you went down to breakfast and there was bird poop on your plate. Blech. And they spent good money on that bird poop because they were starving and that was all they could find to eat. Now, a really terrible thing that some of them did is some of them started killing and eating their own children. Oh, that was horrible, wasn't it? And that's when the king of the king of Israel in Samaria, when he heard this, that some of them were eating their own children, he tore his clothes. And the people could see that underneath his clothes, he was wearing sackcloth, which is kind of like a burlap bag. You know how rough that is? He was wearing it because he was mourning for the people and for his own starvation, probably. But then he said, "The Lord do so and more to me if Elisha's head stays on his shoulders this afternoon." What's he saying? He's saying he wants to chop Elisha's head off. Well, what had Elisha done wrong? Elisha hadn't done anything wrong. Matter of fact, Elisha was the only one in Israel, at least as far as we know, he was the only one who had real joy because he knew that God was in control of this situation. And so Elisha was sitting with the elders in one of the rooms in his house. Maybe it was the only room in his house. And suddenly God spoke to him, and God told him that King Jehoram wanted to take his head off, and that he was sending a messenger to get him. And so Elisha stopped what he was saying with the elders, and he listened to what God was telling him. And he said to the elders, "That King Jehoram, he's coming to take my head off. But there's a messenger coming first, and hold the door against the messenger." And so I suppose they held the door so that the messenger couldn't get in. But the messenger yelled through the door and said, "Why should we wait on the Lord anymore? The Lord's obviously not on our side." And Elisha knew the king was coming behind the messenger. So he waited until the king got there. And the king had with him his right-hand man. Here they are. Bald head. This is Elisha. The crown. This is King Jehoram. And here's the smirk. This is the king's right-hand man. And then Elisha went out and he told them what God said. He said to them, "By this time tomorrow, there'll be so much food that a seah of fine flour will be sold for a shekel at the city gate. And 2 seahs of barley will be sold for a shekel at the city gate." You probably don't know what a seah is, do you? I had to look it up myself. It's about 9 quarts, which would make it, maybe we think of buying flour by the pound. It'd probably be like a 10-pound bag, or a little more than a 10-pound bag of flour. And a shekel was probably about 30 cents. So fine flour was going to be selling really cheap, and barley was going to be selling really cheap at the gate tomorrow at this time. Well, the king's right-hand man looked at him and he smirked. And he said, "Oh man, even if the windows of heaven were to open, if God opened the windows of heaven, this couldn't possibly be." And Elisha said to him, "You'll see it, but you won't get to eat any of it." The king's right-hand man not get to eat any food? That's crazy, right? But God said that's what's going to happen. So let's find out what does happen. Now, outside the city gates, there were 4 lepers. This means that these men had leprosy, which was a terrible disease. It still is a terrible disease. When you get this disease, you have these bumps that grow up on your skin, and you start losing the feeling in your hands and your arms, and eventually you can die from it. And it's very, very, very contagious. Well, back at this time, nobody knew the cure for leprosy. And they knew it was very contagious. So they made these people who were had this disease of leprosy, they made them stay outside the city walls. They had to live outside the city walls. And so that everywhere they went, if they saw other people, they had to warn them that they were lepers and not to come near because it's very, very contagious. Well, these 4 lepers were outside here, outside the city gate, outside the wall. They were up next to the wall, and the Syrian army was out there, right? Camped in their tents. And these guys started talking to each other. And they said, if we stay here, we're going to die because we're not getting any food. Normally, people would throw them some food. And they would have food. People would give them food. But everybody in the city's starving, right? So they're not giving any food to the lepers. So they say, if we stay here, we're going to die. Well, if we go into the city, well, there's no food there, so we'll die there too. What can we do? And they had an idea. They said, now if we go out to the Syrian army and ask them for food, maybe they'll kill us, but maybe they'll give us some food. That's our only hope. And if they kill us, we're going to die anyway. So they decided to go out to the camp of the Syrian army. And I suppose they were kind of scared about going out there. And they're going out there, and as they get closer and closer, it's very quiet in the Syrian camp. Why is it so quiet in this camp? There should be a whole army there making noise, right? And they get into the Syrian camp, and they look around, and there's nobody there. Everybody is gone. Well, how did that happen? This is what happened. God made a noise, and this noise sounded like there was another big army coming to help Israel. And so they thought this big army, the Egyptians maybe, or some of these other countries that are on Israel's side, are coming to fight against them. And they thought it was too big an army for them, and so they were scared. And so they ran. And they ran, and they ran, and they ran all the way home, back to Syria. They left everything there. They just ran and took off. They were so scared. But there wasn't really any army there, was it? Just God making the noise of an army. So these lepers came in, and they went into one tent, and there was food there. And they were eating it and eating it and eating it. And then they started looking around at all these treasures that were in this tent, and they started carrying it all off and hiding it. And then they went into another tent, and they started carrying the stuff out of that tent off and hiding it. And then, here's the Syrian army running away. Here they are looking at all that food, And then one of them said, we're not doing a good thing here. The people in the city are starving, and we have good news for them. If we don't go tell them, then something bad's going to happen to us. And so they went up to the city gate, and they told the guards at the city gate that we went out to the Syrian camp and there's nobody there. They left everything. There's nobody there. And so the guards went and told the king, and the king said, I know what's happening. The Syrians are hiding. And when we come out of the city, they're going to jump out and they're going to get us. And then they'll get into the city. I think that's what's happening. But some of his servants said, wait a minute. We're going to die anyway. Let's go out and check it out. Maybe it's as it seems. Let's take some horses and go out there and check out and see what's going on. So many people in the city have died anyway, and we're going to follow them if we don't get some food. So they went out, and the king said, go check it out. And so they went out, and they looked through the Syrian camp, and they followed where the Syrians had gone, and they followed all the way to the Jordan River, and they found where the Syrians were so scared that they were throwing things down, throwing clothes down so they could run faster. And they followed them all the way to the Jordan River. So they came back and they told the king, well, it's true, the Syrian army's gone. We followed them all the way to the Jordan River and they're gone. They've gone back to Syria. And so the next day at the city gate, they were selling flour, a seah of flour for a shekel, 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, just like Elisha had said. Well, the king put his right-hand man in charge of the gate to make sure things were done in an orderly manner. But the people weren't ready to be orderly. They kind of stampeded to the gate. And they knocked the guy down trying to get to the food. And they trampled on him. And he died. They trampled him to death. And so he did not get any of the food. He saw it, but he didn't get to eat any of it. Just like Elisha had told him was going to happen. Now, you can see in this story that these people were not joyful. They didn't have any joy, except Elisha in the story. He's the only one in the story that has joy, because he knows that God loves him and God's going to take care of this situation. But the others, they don't have joy. Their happiness is depending on their circumstances. You see, that's what we need. We need joy in our lives. We need to let the Holy Spirit grow his joy in us.